Imagine a cop, blinded by prejudice, harassing a frail black woman late at night. But just when he thinks he's in control, she calmly pulls out a badge. An FBI badge. How does one reckless act of violence turn into the downfall of a once powerful officer? And what happens when the very person he tries to intimidate holds all the power? The truth is about to shatter everything he thought he knew. Before we begin with today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Officer Ronald Green sat in his patrol car, his hand resting idly on the steering wheel. The late-night shift in downtown Richmond, Virginia, always felt like it dragged on. Night was no different. The streets were quiet, dim streetlights casting their glow over the cracked pavement. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the old liquor store that had been closed for years. There was no action, no excitement, just another uneventful night in a neighborhood he had written off long ago. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 2:14 a.m. 2 more hours before his shift ended. He groaned and ran a hand through his short, dark hair. The monotony was unbearable. Richmond's South Side had been a dead zone for as long as he could remember. Boarded-up buildings, decaying homes, and people who, in his mind, had given up on trying to improve their lives. They just didn't care anymore. Or at least, that's how he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure moving slowly along the sidewalk, just a few blocks away. A woman, her silhouette hunched over, clutching a plastic bag in one hand and a cane in the other. Ronald squinted, trying to get a better look. She wore a long coat, oversized for her small frame, and a large brimmed hat that hid her face. She didn't look like someone out for a late-night stroll. Too old, too frail. What's she doing out here? He muttered to himself. His curiosity piqued, and something about her just felt off. Ronald's instincts told him that trouble came in all shapes and forms, and appearances could easily deceive. His gut told him she didn't belong there, not at this time of night, not in this part of town. He had learned over the years to trust his gut. After all, it rarely let him down. He drove slowly past her, eyes narrowing as he watched her shuffle forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She wasn't in any rush, but then again, she wasn't doing anything specific either. Just standing there, like she was waiting for something. Ronald frowned. Was she loitering? Homeless? Up to something worse? His mind raced with possibilities. He pulled his squad car to the curb, engine still running. Watching her made him feel uneasy. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but that didn't matter. Her very presence at this hour seemed suspicious. Something about her didn't sit right with him. As he unbuckled his seatbelt, the sense of power that came with the badge washed over him. He could already feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was in moments like this that Ronald thrived. The thrill of control, of asserting authority, was what kept him going on nights like these. Without another thought, he stepped out of the car, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement breaking the silence of the quiet street. The woman didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't quicken her pace like others did when they saw an officer coming their way. Her calmness irritated him. It didn't fit the script. She was supposed to be nervous. People like her, people in this neighborhood, knew to keep their heads down when police were around. "Hey!" Ronald called out, his voice echoing in the empty street. The woman stopped but didn't turn around. He approached her, his posture rigid, every inch of him exuding authority. "Ma'am, it's late. What are you doing out here?" His voice was sharp, clipped, the kind of tone that demanded an immediate answer. She finally turned to face him, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and that irritated him even more. Up close, she looked even older than he first thought. Wrinkled skin, frail hands that seemed to shake ever so slightly. Her clothes looked secondhand, worn down like she'd had them for years. But that didn't matter to Ronald. He was looking for something more, something that would justify his suspicion. "I'm just heading home, officer," she replied, her voice soft but firm. He didn't buy it. "At this hour?" He glanced at the plastic bag she was holding. "What's in the bag?" She lifted it slightly. "Groceries. Nothing more." Ronald scoffed. It wasn't enough. His mind raced, searching for a way to escalate the situation. He had dealt with too many people who thought they could outsmart him, who thought they were smarter than the law. This woman, with her calmness, was getting under his skin. She wasn't playing the part of the scared, cooperative civilian, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. "Show me what's inside," he demanded, his voice lowering. He needed control of this situation, needed to remind her who held the power here. She sighed, but didn't argue. Slowly, she opened the bag, showing him a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few cans of soup. Nothing out of the ordinary. Ronald felt a flash of disappointment. He had expected more. "That's all you're carrying?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his tone. His eyes flicked around, searching for any witnesses, anyone who might be watching. There were none. The woman nodded, silent once again. Ronald's frustration mounted. He could feel his control slipping, and it infuriated him. He needed to reassert himself, to remind her of who was in charge. He couldn't let her walk away just like that. "Let me see your ID," he ordered, stepping closer. His voice was cold now, laced with the unspoken threat that he wasn't going to back down. The woman didn't protest. She reached into her coat pocket slowly, pulling out a worn wallet and handing him her ID. Her name was Helen Brooks, the address local. Nothing suspicious. Ronald flicked the ID back to her, more aggressively than necessary. "You're out here for a reason," he growled, leaning closer, his face inches from hers. "You think I don't know that?" Helen looked up at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I told you, officer. I'm just trying to get home." Her calmness, her refusal to show any sign of fear, only stoked the flames of Ronald's growing anger. She wasn't scared of him, and that was unacceptable. His authority was supposed to command respect. No, fear. Yet here she was, standing her ground. "You shouldn't be here at this time of night," he spat, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Do you know what happens around here? It's not safe." "I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer," Helen replied, her voice still as steady as before. "Standing outside a store isn't one of them." Her words stung, though Ronald couldn't fully grasp why. Maybe it was the way she said them, so calmly, like she had nothing to fear. Or maybe it was the subtle challenge in her words, the way she implied that she had seen worse than him. He stepped closer, his chest nearly touching hers, his breath hot with barely restrained rage. He couldn't take it anymore. This woman, this frail, calm, seemingly insignificant woman, had somehow managed to get under his skin. "You don't get to stand here and talk to me like that," he hissed, his grip tightening on her arm. She looked down at his hand, then back up at him, still calm, still composed. "Let go of me," she said softly, but firmly. Ronald's grip only tightened. How dare she tell him what to do? How dare she refuse to submit? His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation, to force her into the role he needed her to play, the one where she was scared and obedient. "You think you can just stand here and disrespect me?" he growled, his voice barely more than a whisper now. But Helen didn't flinch. "This isn't about me, officer," she said quietly. "It's about you." Her words cut deeper than any physical blow, and for the first time, Ronald felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. A flicker of uncertainty crept into his mind, making him question his actions, his motives. Before he could fully process it, his body reacted. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her closer. His frustration boiled over, and before he knew it, his fist connected with the side of her face. Helen stumbled, her cane falling to the ground as she tried to steady herself. The groceries in her bag spilled across the pavement, cans rolling into the gutter. She didn't cry out, didn't scream. She simply wiped a trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth and slowly stood back up. Ronald stood there, frozen for a moment, his fist still clenched, his mind reeling from what he had just done. The silence was deafening, and for the first time that night, fear crept into his chest. Not for his safety, but for what might come next. "You're going to regret that," Helen said softly, her voice carrying a weight that sent a chill through Ronald's body. Before he could respond, she reached into her coat pocket. Ronald's instincts kicked in, and his hand went to his holster, fingers curling around his gun. But she wasn't pulling out a weapon. She held out a small black leather wallet and flipped it open. Inside, gleaming in the dim streetlight, was a badge. FBI. "I'm Special Agent Helen Brooks," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And you just made a very big mistake." The world seemed to tilt around Ronald as the weight of her words sank in. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He had just assaulted an undercover FBI agent. Panic surged through him, and for the first time in his career, Ronald Green didn't know what to do. For a moment, Ronald stood frozen, his mind blank with shock. He had never felt so powerless, so caught off guard. The authority he wielded so confidently moments ago had been ripped away in an instant. An FBI agent? How could he have missed it? Panic bubbled in his chest, threatening to overtake him, but he couldn't show it. Not now. Not with her standing there, calm as ever, with the badge still in her hand. Helen's eyes never left his. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. The weight of her presence, of the truth she had revealed, hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating his confidence. Forcing himself to move, Ronald took a step back, trying to regain his composure. His mind raced, searching for a way out, some excuse that would justify his actions. Maybe he could downplay it, say it was a misunderstanding, an unfortunate accident. But deep down, he knew there was no way to spin this. "Look," Ronald finally said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know. You weren't acting like..." "Like what, Officer Green?" Helen interrupted, her tone controlled but pointed. "Like someone who deserves respect?" Her words cut deep, twisting in his gut. He tried to respond, but no words came. What could he say? He had judged her the second he saw her. He had assumed things about her that weren't true, let his own prejudices guide his actions, and now he was paying the price. Helen took a slow step forward, and though she was much smaller than him, Ronald suddenly felt dwarfed by her presence. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and she was in control. "You made your assumptions the moment you saw me," Helen continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "You saw an older black woman, alone at night, and you thought you could treat me however you wanted. But you didn't stop to think, because people like you never do." Ronald flinched. Her words were sharp, cutting through the last remnants of his defenses. He had nothing to say, nothing to defend himself with. She was right. He had jumped to conclusions. And now, his career, no, his life, was hanging by a thread. I didn't mean to," Ronald stammered, his voice weak, barely more than a whisper. "It just got out of hand." Helen raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's what people like you always say when you're caught. You didn't mean to, but the truth is, you never thought there would be consequences." Ronald's stomach churned with guilt, his palms sweaty as the reality of the situation sank in. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now he was at her mercy. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens pierced the quiet night. Ronald's heart raced. Backup was coming, but not for him. He knew it the second he heard those sirens. They were coming for her, for Special Agent Helen Brooks, and when they arrived, he would be the one left to answer for what he had done. Helen didn't flinch at the sound. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You should start thinking about what you're going to say, Officer Green," she said quietly, "because things are about to get very serious for you." Ronald swallowed hard, his throat dry. The sirens grew louder, closer. Time was running out. He needed to say something, anything, to fix this. But there was nothing he could do. He had already sealed his fate with that single, reckless punch. Moments later, 2 squad cars screeched to a stop at the end of the street. Several uniformed officers stepped out, their hands on their holsters, but Helen waved them off with a calm gesture. They lowered their weapons, though they kept their eyes on Ronald. Helen turned to face them. "I'm fine," she said, her voice even. "But Officer Green here has some explaining to do." The lead officer, Sergeant Miller, approached cautiously, his eyes darting between Ronald and Helen. He looked confused, unsure of what to make of the scene before him. "Special Agent Brooks?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "What happened here?" Helen didn't take her eyes off Ronald as she spoke. "Officer Green here assaulted me while I was conducting an undercover operation. I'll need to file an official report." Ronald felt his stomach drop. Assault. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no coming back from this. He could feel the other officers' eyes on him, their judgment clear in their expressions. He had crossed a line, and now everyone knew it. Sergeant Miller's face hardened as he turned to Ronald. "Green, is this true?" Ronald opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was blank, spinning with panic. What could he possibly say? That he hadn't known? That he hadn't meant to? None of it mattered now. His silence was all the answer Miller needed. "Turn around," Miller ordered, his voice cold. For a moment, Ronald hesitated, his body frozen in place. The world felt like it was crashing down around him, every possibility slipping through his fingers. But there was no escape. Slowly he turned around, placing his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs felt final, like the slamming of a cell door. Miller gave him a rough shove, guiding him toward the waiting squad car. As he was led away, Ronald risked one last glance at Helen. She stood there, calm and composed, watching him with an unreadable expression. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain. But there was no point. She had already made up her mind, and so had everyone else. The door of the squad car slammed shut behind him, and as the vehicle pulled away, Ronald realized that his life as he knew it was over. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had once nodded to him in respect now avoided his gaze. Ronald was no longer one of them. He was the guy who had assaulted an FBI agent, someone who had let his temper and biases destroy everything he had worked for. The holding cell they placed him in was small, cold, and claustrophobic. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, adding to the sense of dread that had settled deep in his bones. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over, searching for a way to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. He had messed up, big time, and now he had to face the consequences. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Ronald sat on the hard bench, his hands resting on his knees, trying to figure out what would happen next. Would he be fired? Charged? Would this go public? The thought made his stomach churn. Just then, the door to the holding area opened, and Sergeant Miller stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Green," he called, motioning for Ronald to stand. "They're ready for you." Ronald's heart pounded as he followed Miller down the long, dimly lit corridor. They reached the interrogation room, and Miller opened the door, gesturing for him to enter. Ronald stepped inside, his pulse quickening. Sitting at the table, calm as ever, was Helen Brooks. Across from her sat an FBI agent Ronald didn't recognize. His heart sank further. This was serious. More serious than he had thought. "Officer Green," Helen said, her voice measured. "Please, have a seat." Ronald hesitated for a moment, but then complied, sinking into the cold metal chair. He couldn't meet her gaze. The weight of what he had done hung heavy over him. The agent across from him, a tall man with sharp eyes, cleared his throat. "Officer Green, we're here to discuss the incident that occurred earlier tonight. Special Agent Brooks has already given her account of what happened, but we want to hear your side of the story." Ronald's mouth went dry. What could he say? That he had acted out of frustration? That he had lost control? None of it felt like it would make a difference now. I made a mistake," he began, his voice barely audible. "I didn't realize who she was. I thought she was just another what?" Helen interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Another person who didn't deserve your respect? Another person you thought you could intimidate?" Ronald flinched, her words cutting deep. He didn't have an answer. She was right. He had judged her the moment he saw her. His assumptions, his prejudices, had led him down this path, and now there was no way to undo the damage. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Ronald said quietly, his voice weak. "It just got out of hand." Helen leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "Officer Green, this isn't just about tonight. This is about how people like you, people with power, use that power to hurt others. You assumed the worst about me because of how I looked, because of where I was. You didn't stop to think for a second that maybe I was just a person, minding my own business." Ronald's chest tightened. He had no defense, no way to explain what had driven him to that moment of violence. All he could do was sit there, drowning in the weight of his own actions. The other agent spoke up, his voice cold and detached. "Officer Green, you will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. You'll also be facing charges of assault on a federal agent." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. Suspended. Charges. His entire career, everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Helen stood up slowly, her eyes still fixed on him. "You have to live with what you've done," she said quietly. "I hope you think about the choices you made tonight." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Ronald alone with the crushing weight of his guilt. Ronald stared at the door after Helen left, the sound of it closing echoing in his mind. For a long moment, he didn't move. He sat frozen in place, the enormity of what had just happened pressing down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. Suspended. Facing charges. His mind raced with images of what his future could look like now. He imagined himself in court, in front of a judge, standing there as Helen testified against him. He felt a surge of anger, at himself, at the situation, at how quickly things had spiraled out of control. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the cold surface of the table. How had it come to this? How had one moment of weakness, one split-second decision, completely turned his life upside down? The door opened again, and Sergeant Miller stepped in, his expression hard. "You're going to be processed now, Green. They'll walk you through what's next." Ronald stood slowly, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He followed Miller in silence, his mind numb, trying to accept that this was his reality now. The other officers who passed him in the hallway avoided eye contact. The people he once worked with, once shared camaraderie with, were now looking at him as if he was already a criminal. He was one of them, but now, not one of them at all. Once they reached the processing room, Ronald was given forms to sign, informing him of his suspension and the upcoming legal proceedings. As he signed his name on the dotted line, it felt like he was signing away everything that had once defined him. "You'll need to hand over your badge and your gun," Miller said, his voice flat. Ronald hesitated for a moment, but then reached down to unclip the badge from his chest. The weight of it in his hand felt different now. Heavier, like it no longer belonged to him. He placed it on the table next to his service weapon. His identity as a police officer stripped away in an instant. Miller nodded toward the door. "You're free to go for now. But don't get too comfortable. You'll be hearing from the department soon." Ronald turned to leave, feeling like a ghost walking through the precinct. The hallways, once familiar and filled with purpose, now felt foreign, like he didn't belong there anymore. He kept his head down as he made his way to the exit, trying to ignore the stares, the whispers that followed him. When he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap in the face. It was strange. Just hours ago, he had been patrolling these streets with a sense of authority, with the confidence that he was in control. Now, it all felt different. The city, the streets, the people, everything looked different through the lens of his downfall. Ronald's mind wandered back to Helen Brooks, the way she had stood there, unwavering, even after he struck her. He had never seen someone so calm, so composed under such circumstances. Her words echoed in his mind. "This isn't about me. It's about you." Those words had stuck with him, gnawing at his conscience, forcing him to confront something he had been trying to avoid his whole career. His own biases, his own assumptions, his own failure to treat people with dignity. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew Helen was right. He had seen her, not for who she was, but for what he assumed she represented. She had challenged his authority simply by existing in a way that didn't fit his expectations, and that had enraged him. His reaction had been fueled by his own deep-seated prejudice, a prejudice he hadn't even realized he harbored until now. Ronald walked the streets aimlessly for a while, not knowing where to go or what to do. The weight of his mistake clung to him, suffocating him with each step. He thought about going home, but the thought of sitting in his apartment, alone with his thoughts, was unbearable. He couldn't face it. After what felt like hours, he found himself in front of a small bar, the neon sign flickering above the door. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The bar was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered throughout the room. Ronald walked up to the counter, sinking onto a stool, and ordered a drink. The bartender handed him a glass, and he downed it in one gulp, hoping to drown out the gnawing guilt that was eating away at him. But no amount of alcohol could silence the voice in his head, the voice telling him that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He ordered another drink, and then another. But it didn't help. All he could think about was what came next. The investigation, the trial, the inevitable fallout. He pictured his name in the headlines. Officer charged with assaulting FBI agent. The media would tear him apart. His reputation would be in shambles. He'd be lucky if he ever found another job again. As the hours passed, Ronald found himself slipping further and further into a haze of regret and self-loathing. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't go back in time and make a different choice. All he could do was face the consequences. Ronald turned to leave, feeling like a ghost walking through the precinct. The hallways, once familiar and filled with purpose, now felt foreign, like he didn't belong there anymore. He kept his head down as he made his way to the exit, trying to ignore the stares, the whispers that followed him. When he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap in the face. It was strange. Just hours ago, he had been patrolling these streets with a sense of authority, with the confidence that he was in control. Now, it all felt different. The city, the streets, the people, everything looked different through the lens of his downfall. Ronald's mind wandered back to Helen Brooks, the way she had stood there, unwavering, even after he struck her. He had never seen someone so calm, so composed under such circumstances. Her words echoed in his mind. "This isn't about me. It's about you." Those words had stuck with him, gnawing at his conscience, forcing him to confront something he had been trying to avoid his whole career. His own biases, his own assumptions, his own failure to treat people with dignity. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew Helen was right. He had seen her, not for who she was, but for what he assumed she represented. She had challenged his authority simply by existing in a way that didn't fit his expectations, and that had enraged him. His reaction had been fueled by his own deep-seated prejudice, a prejudice he hadn't even realized he harbored until now. Ronald walked the streets aimlessly for a while, not knowing where to go or what to do. The weight of his mistake clung to him, suffocating him with each step. He thought about going home, but the thought of sitting in his apartment, alone with his thoughts, was unbearable. He couldn't face it. After what felt like hours, he found himself in front of a small bar, the neon sign flickering above the door. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The bar was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered throughout the room. Ronald walked up to the counter, sinking onto a stool, and ordered a drink. The bartender handed him a glass, and he downed it in one gulp, hoping to drown out the gnawing guilt that was eating away at him. But no amount of alcohol could silence the voice in his head, the voice telling him that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He ordered another drink, and then another. But it didn't help. All he could think about was what came next. The investigation, the trial, the inevitable fallout. He pictured his name in the headlines. Officer charged with assaulting FBI agent. The media would tear him apart. His reputation would be in shambles. He'd be lucky if he ever found another job again. As the hours passed, Ronald found himself slipping further and further into a haze of regret and self-loathing. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't go back in time and make a different choice. All he could do was face the consequences. Ronald swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to prepare yourself," the lawyer said. "This isn't going to end well for you." When Ronald arrived at the courthouse on the day of the hearing, the gravity of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as he walked past them, their questions shouted in his direction. But Ronald didn't respond. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, trying to block out the noise. Inside, the courtroom was cold and sterile. Ronald sat at the defense table next to his lawyer, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Across the room, Helen Brooks sat with the prosecution, her expression unreadable. Ronald couldn't bring himself to look at her for more than a few seconds. The guilt was too much. The hearing was brief. The judge set bail, and the trial date was scheduled. Ronald felt like he was watching it all from a distance, like it wasn't really happening to him. But it was. His life was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. After the hearing, Ronald was escorted out of the courtroom by his lawyer, the weight of everything pressing down on him harder than ever. "I think we should consider a plea deal," his lawyer said, as they walked out of the courthouse. "It might be your best shot at avoiding a long sentence." Ronald nodded numbly. A plea deal. It wasn't the future he had imagined for himself, but then again, none of this was. Weeks later, after endless discussions and negotiations, the plea deal was finalized. Ronald would plead guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for a lighter sentence. It was the best he could hope for. On the day of his sentencing, Ronald stood in front of the judge, his heart pounding in his chest. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and Helen Brooks sat in the front row, watching him closely. The judge's voice echoed in his ears as she handed down the sentence: 6 months in prison, followed by probation. It was a mercy compared to what it could have been. But to Ronald, it still felt like the end of everything. As he was led away in handcuffs, he caught one last glimpse of Helen. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. She had warned him that his actions had consequences, and now he was facing them. In the months that followed, as Ronald served his sentence, he had a lot of time to think, to reflect on the choices he had made, the assumptions he had lived by, and the person he had become. The walls of his cell were a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his prejudice, for his inability to see beyond the surface. But perhaps the most painful realization was that none of this had been necessary. If he had treated Helen with respect from the beginning, if he had just taken a moment to think before acting, none of this would have happened. His career, his freedom, his reputation, they were all gone because of a moment of weakness, a moment of judgment. By the time Ronald was released from prison, the world had moved on. But he hadn't. The weight of his actions still hung over him, a constant reminder of the damage he had done, to himself, to Helen, to the people he had once sworn to protect. He knew he couldn't undo the past. But as he walked out of those prison gates, He promised himself that he would never let his prejudice blind him again.